The river shimmers like molten bronze under the Anatolian sun, but its beauty is a lie. Beneath the sparkling skin lurks a current swift enough to drown an unsteady horse and cold enough to sap a man's courage the instant it rises over his boots. On the far bank, dark shapes glitter, Persian cuirasses catching the same sunlight, their owners silent, confident, certain they will throw the brash Macedonian king back into the water or drown him in it. Yet among the men splashing on the near bank, there is no wavering. They whisper a single name, Alexander, and the name itself feels like a shield. What the Persians see as another ambitious monarch, these soldiers know as a force of nature. They are 22, 18, even 15, but they march as if centuries of destiny lean on their shoulders. In their minds, this day is already carved in marble. The dust has not yet risen, yet bards across Greece will sing that on the banks of the Granicus, a legend found its first iron heartbeat. 100 years from now, philosophers will argue whether destiny or daring crossed the river first. But the men waiting to mount up need no debate. The only truth that matters is about to erupt in bronze and blood. When the king raises his scarlet cloak, Alexander's cavalry will explode forward, hooves shattering the mirror of the river, first ripples of a conquest that will roll all the way to the ends of the earth. Blazing out of this hook of anticipation comes the wider drama. Before the dawn mist lifted over the Hellespont, Alexander's dreams already stretched beyond the horizon. He was 22, crowned scarcely 2 years, and still the ghost of his father, Philip II, stalked every council chamber in Pella. Brilliant, towering, impossible to equal. Macedonian nobles whispered that the boy king inherited a throne polished by Philip's genius and an army drilled by the same hand. Athens and Thebes prayed the weight of the diadem would fold the upstart's neck. Across the Aegean, great King Darius III of Persia dismissed him as a local bully boy, fit to terrorize minor satraps, but no match for imperial power. Alexander answered those doubts with action. While Thessalian rebels still dithered, he rode south, seized Thebes in a storm of stone throwers and siege towers, and razed its proud battlements in 2 brutal days. The message was unmistakable. The new king was more lightning than shadow. With Greece terrified into silence and a coalition fleet waiting at Abydos, he fired off orders that shimmered with audacity. The entire Macedonian expeditionary force would cross into Asia in 1 month. No protracted buildup, no wintering at Ephesus, just the clang of iron boots on foreign soil and a promise to take the war to Persia before Persia could blink. The crossing alone felt mythic. Tradition said that Xerxes, king of kings, once lashed the Hellespont in rage when a storm smashed his pontoon bridges on the march to Greece. Alexander performed the opposite ritual. Hurling a spear from the prow of his ship onto Asian ground, he claimed the vast continent as spear-won land, a personal offering to the gods of invasion. Priests read omens in the smoke. Flames rose straight, a sign of favor, and mainland Greece vanished behind the fleet's foaming wakes. Yet strategy, not spectacle, was the engine of this lightning thrust. Intelligence from the Greek exile Memnon of Rhodes warned Persian satraps to scorch Ionia, draw Alexander deep, starve his army, and let the royal fleet sever his supply line. But satrapian arrogance overruled caution. Proud of their cavalry and contemptuous of Greek barbarians, they massed at the Granicus, intent on smashing Alexander at the first crossing and parading his head before Darius. This overconfidence would prove Persia's undoing. Alexander understood the stakes intimately. He had with him barely over 30,000 infantry, roughly 12,000 Macedonian Phalangites, 7,000 allied hoplites, and 5,000 light troops, supported by 5,000 horse. A mighty host for a Greek city, but a raindrop in the deserts of Asia. The only hope was to win fast and win decisively, breaking each satrapial army before it could fuse into a royal juggernaut. That calculus made Granicus more than a river. It was a gate. On the western side lay one brief chance to punch open the Persian frontier. On the eastern spread a landmass whose riches could feed Alexander's ambition for decades. The king's council urged caution. Parmenion, gray-bearded and battle-scarred, argued for a dawn attack the following day when the water was lower. Alexander smiled, thanked his mentor, and mounted Bucephalus. Opportunity, he believed, was a stallion with a single firm grip on the reins. Hesitate, and it would gallop away forever. At the water's edge, the sky blazed copper. Alexander ordered the trumpet blown. Phalangites shifted their 16-foot sarissas to an oblique angle, forming a forest of bright needles atop the banks. Companion cavalrymen adjusted the white plumes on their bronze helmets, nerves sharpening into hunger. From the Persian lines came the jangle of silver bridle plates and the deep beat of war drums. Spithridates, satrap of Lydia, laughed aloud when he saw Macedonian banners nosing toward the flood. Let them come, he thought. The river will drown half and panic the rest. He could not imagine an enemy leaping into chest-deep water in full armor. He was right. No ordinary commander would. But ordinary commanders are born, not taught by Aristotle, tempered in Philip's anvil, or aflame with visions granted by Olympian thunder. The bugle shrieked again, and 6 squadrons of companions lunged into the Granicus, spray exploding around spear points, hooves scrambling for purchase on slick stones. Behind them thundered the royal squadron, with Alexander at its core, scarlet plume whipping like a comet's tail. Instantly, the river transformed into chaos. Horses rearing, shields half-submerged, sunlight splintering in water droplets that flew like a rain of molten metal. From a distance, the charge looked suicidal, but it was executed with lethal geometry. Alexander angled upstream, letting the current drift his riders toward a gravel bar directly beneath the highest Persian concentration. That bar, unseen from the opposite bluff, granted just enough footing for a frenzied redeployment. As the first companions surged up the far bank, they found the Persian horse waiting not in loose skirmish order, but pressed to the brink of the escarpment, stirrup to stirrup, unable to generate the momentum required for a countercharge. Lances cracked. The slope acted like a rampart, Macedonians climbing, Persians stabbing down. But the attackers possessed the advantage of shock and the invincible morale that only belief in a living god-king can breed. Amid the maelstrom, Alexander hunted with surgical fury. He singled out Mithridates, son-in-law of the great king, knocked aside the satrap's spear, and skewered him through corselet and spine. Before the corpse struck earth, Alexander wheeled toward Spithridates. The Lydian swung an axe the size of a shield, blades shrieking inches from the king's neck. In that frozen instant, Clytus the Black, Alexander's boyhood friend, hacked off the satrap's arm at the shoulder. Blood geysered. The Persian vanguard buckled. Macedonian line infantry began their crossing in echelon formation. Hoplites locked shields, sarissas bristling overhead like a killer grove. Trumpeters signaled the hypaspists, elite foot guards, to seize a narrow ford further south, flanking the Persian cavalry from below. Parmenians, Thessalian riders veered north, drawing enemy reserves away from Alexander's focal point. Every movement harmonized with the king's central chord. Fracture the Persian cavalry, then hammer the stranded Greek mercenary infantry before it could withdraw. Memnon's mercenaries watched in horror as their mounted screen evaporated. They were professionals, 10,000 strong, veterans of Egyptian marches, but no infantry relishes facing the Macedonian phalanx alone. When Alexander's horsemen burst past the faltering satraps and pivoted inward, the mercenaries formed a bristling hedgehog, shields overlapping, spears slanted. They fought like cornered lions, but discipline could not conjure miracles. The sarissa wall advanced inexorably, pikes punching through wooden aspides, collapsing ranks like rotted wicker. Macedonian swordsmen flooded the gaps, and soon Greek cries for quarter pierced the din. Alexander, furious that fellow Hellenes had sold their spears to Persia, accepted surrender only after a butchery intended to terrify future mercenaries. Those who survived were shackled and sent to hard labor in Macedon's mines, a living testament to the price of fighting against their homeland. By dusk, the Granicus ran crimson. Persian noble corpses carpeted the riverbank. Their loss would haunt Darius far beyond the tactical defeat, for each dead baron represented a province stripped of its military spine. Alexander did not pause to mourn. He exulted. 300 Persian panoplies were collected and shipped to Athens as votive trophies, hung in the Parthenon beneath a plaque. Alexander, son of Philip, and all Hellenes except the Spartans, from the barbarians of Asia. The phrase was a masterstroke of propaganda, reminding Greece, who now led the war of revenge for Marathon and Salamis. Next, Alexander dispatched cavalry columns across Ionia and Aeolus. Sardis capitulated without a fight, its fabled citadel too awestruck to resist. Ephesus expelled the Persian garrison within days, reinstalling democratic government under Macedonian patronage. Temple treasuries flowed into the campaign chest. Local Greek cities welcomed the liberator who paid soldiers with Persian bullion instead of draining Greek coffers. Alexander's gamble at the Granicus thus snowballed into a rolling annexation of the western satrapies, each surrender feeding the next in a cascade of shock and awe. Yet victory also birthed new dilemmas. Memnon, escaped with a handful of ships, urged Darius to unleash the vast royal navy against Alexander's vulnerable Aegean supply line. Macedonian sea power was a brittle mosaic of allied contingents. If cut, the king would be stranded. Alexander countered not by ship, but by speed. He stormed inland, besieging Halicarnassus, where Memnon regrouped. The walls were renowned as impregnable, engineers boasting double curtain defenses and towers thick enough to shrug off siege rams. Alexander built movable turrets higher than the parapets, draped them in fireproof hides soaked in vinegar, and advanced under a hail of arrows until scaling ladders scraped stone. After bitter night assaults and countermines that collapsed entire bastions, the city burned. Memnon fled again, but the Persian high command awoke to a terrible arithmetic. Each month, Alexander advanced deeper. More Anatolian satrapies crumbled, and the royal treasury hemorrhaged talent and taxes. Darius could no longer dismiss the Macedonian as a heroic nuisance. He summoned the full might of the empire east of the Tigris, vowing to annihilate the invader at Issus. The Granicus, once a minor frontier skirmish in Persian eyes, had mutated into an existential threat. For the men who fought it, however, the battle's meaning was immediate and visceral. Ask the Hypaspist, who dragged a severed Persian standard across the ford, or the Thessalian, who speared 2 noblemen in single combat. Victory tasted like iron-flecked foam and felt like immortality. Veterans would retell the moment Alexander vaulted the river ahead of all, his white plume arrow straight, despite the spray shouting promises of glory to any who could follow. They would remember how their king bled that afternoon, his shoulder slit by a scimitar, and fought on as though ichor filled his veins. Around Macedonian campfires for years thereafter, veterans would tap their scarred helmets and say, "Here is where Granicus struck but did not break me," and raw recruits would hush, imagining what it felt like to ride through water into death and emerge reborn. Strategically, the battle unleashed 3 currents that swept the wider campaign. First, it shattered Persian confidence in Greek mercenaries, a pillar of their Western defense strategy. Second, it severed the land bridge between the empire's Aegean possessions and its Levantine heartlands, forcing any counteroffensive to march north through inhospitable terrain. Third, it cemented the cult of Alexander among Macedonian and Asiatic Greeks alike, an aura that made later sieges shorter, negotiations smoother, and rebellions rarer. Where a lesser commander might have celebrated and consolidated, Alexander transformed the triumph into momentum, careening toward the Cilician gates and the fateful plain of Issus. But that is another thunderclap in the long storm of his conquests. Granicus remains the first flash, the electric moment when history realized Philip's heir was not merely competent, but catastrophic to Persia. The river lies quiet now, its banks carpeted in spring flowers, its stones cool beneath fishermen's bare feet. Nothing in the hush suggests that cavalry once churned this water into a killing froth, that princes drowned in their armor, where trout now dart between weeds. But listen closely at dusk, after the muezzin's call fades over the distant village, and you may hear phantom hoofbeats. They echo because Granicus was a border not simply between provinces, but between eras. On one shore stood the age of the independent Greek polis and the once invincible Achaemenid Empire. On the other began the Hellenistic world, stamped with Alexander's restless profile. The river remembers its role in that metamorphosis. So do we, every time we trace a map of the Mediterranean and note how Greek ideas blossomed from Egypt to Bactria, seeded in the soil watered first by the Granicus. Across millennia, the lesson endures. Boldness can bend on giants. When obstacles loom like armored nobles on a bluff, the answer may not be to wait for daylight, but to spur your horse straight into the flood, trusting that preparation, unity, and audacity can make depth itself an ally. Alexander's splash was heard from Troy to Persepolis, and its ripples still lap against our imagination today. We study his tactics to master strategy, debate his ethics to refine leadership, invoke his name whenever vision dares to outrun resources. But whether statesman or student, soldier or storyteller, each of us can claim a personal Granicus, the daunting river that guards our greatest ambitions. The crossing is never comfortable, it is usually reckless. Yet triumph favors the one who leaps first and fights hardest on the far bank. If this journey through steel and stamina has stirred your sense of possibility, do not let the story end at a fading screen. Raise your own banner of curiosity. Subscribe to the channel, ignite the notification bell, and march with us into the next clash, where history's pulse beats loud enough to shake the present. Share the video so fellow adventurers can find their river to cross. Drop a comment on the bold moment that inspired you most, and together we will keep pushing the frontiers of insight. The Granicus belongs not only to Alexander, but to every mind willing to ride with courage into the unknown. Will you seize the reins,